She thought she owned the neighborhood. Rules didn't apply to her, at least not in her mind. So when she saw an empty garage belonging to her black neighbor, she didn't hesitate. She slid her car inside as if it were her right. To her, he didn't belong here anyway. But what she didn't know was that this man wasn't just any homeowner. He had the power to make a single decision that would turn her arrogance into a nightmare. What began as an act of entitlement would spiral into something much darker, a confrontation that revealed the ugly truths hiding behind closed doors. This wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about control, dignity, and the invisible line drawn between who is seen as welcome and who is not. When the garage door closed, so did her false sense of safety. And what happened next would leave an entire community questioning everything. They thought they knew. How far would she go to protect her privilege? And how far would he go to finally stand his ground? It was the kind of morning that made people believe in ordinary miracles. Sun lifting slowly over the hedges, dew clinging like glass beads to the grass, and a hush that felt almost sacred. Oak Ridge sold itself on that hush, on the illusion that life there ran on courteous nods, carefully ironed rules, and the gentle hum of predictability. For Marcus Daniels, Oak Ridge had been a goal, a promise he had kept to himself through years of overtime and second jobs. He had arrived at this address not by accident but by intention, each paycheck folded into a plan that had finally produced a mailbox with his name on it and a two-story brick house with a wide garage that smelled faintly of oil and lemon cleaner. Marcus's life had never been dramatic. That was part of why the house meant so much. Workdays blurred into reliable patterns. Early runs to keep his head clear, a shower, coffee in a chipped mug he'd had since college, then a commute that most weeks amounted to a few steps into a quiet home office where servers and codes kept him company. He loved the small certainties, the way his tools lined the garage wall like an ordered army, the exact angle at which afternoon light hit his workbench, the way the garage radio played old soul songs when he tinkered on Saturdays. Those were small sanctities he had built for himself. They were proofs against the long seasons when he'd been told he was too loud, too assertive, too something because of how he carried himself in rooms that didn't expect him. Owning this house felt like an answer to all of those corrections. A place where his presence didn't have to be negotiated. The journey to that stability had not been clean. Marcus carried the quiet residue of workrooms where compliments came wrapped in surprise, hiring managers who would praise his technical skill and then ask pointed questions about fit, and colleagues who mistook politeness for an invitation to make small discriminatory jokes. Those moments had taught him a language of restraint. How to smile when the tone was wrong, how to apologize preemptively for taking up space, how to attend neighborhood meetings and bend his voice low so his words would not threaten. He never wanted his life to be a confrontation. He wanted it to be ordinary and steady, and above all, his Oak Ridge's Homeowners Association liked to say it preserved value. Its notices felt more like doctrine. The HOA meetings turned into a theater of thinly veiled judgments. Rules about mailbox flags and mulch colors were debated with the gravity of scripture. Marcus attended once, hands folded, his presence a polite disruption. He left with several helpful reminders about lawn height and an odd note about community fit. He shrugged then. He told himself people clung to rules when they felt uncertain. He told himself he would not let petty bureaucrats decide the worth of his life. At the center of those meetings, and more accurately, at the center of many neighbors' nerves, was Linda Carter. She had been in Oak Ridge decades before Marcus arrived, a woman with a reputation for vigilance and a taste for enforcement. Her yard was immaculate, flowers clipped into exact circles, her mailbox always polished to a shine. She took pride in the neighborhood's order as if it were a reflection of her own moral clarity. To some, Linda was simply committed. To Marcus, and to others not invited into her circle, she was the kind of person who owned rules like armor. Her look at Marcus when he first moved in had been a study in assessment, a measuring gaze that had lingered longer than politeness required, as if cataloging everything that did not belong to her taste. He remembered the chill of it and how, for a year after, her audits found him first, Those early months were an education in microaggressions disguised as civic duty. A bright yellow violation slipped beneath his door for a hedge that was technically over the allowed height, even though he had trimmed it. Another notice for a trash can allegedly left out past collection time the night the notice appeared. Security footage showed a person not unlike Linda walking back a curbside can beneath the street lamp, pausing as if staging a scene. These were small things in isolation, petty annoyances to be filed away and obeyed. Together they stitched a pattern. Someone ensuring Marcus's presence required constant proof. The underlying message was colder than the notes themselves. It was a reminder that he was watched, measured, and that his belonging could be questioned at any minute. Despite all this, Marcus worked at belonging like a gardener tending to a sensitive sapling. He hosted a small cookout when he moved in, bringing the sort of casseroles people accepted politely. He brought baked goods to neighbors with a humble hope for reciprocity. Some responses were warm, some tepid, many guarded, with the thin courtesy of people who kept separate lives behind closed doors. To his relief, a few neighbors smiled with genuine welcome. The mail carrier who waved each morning, Mrs. Hernandez who walked her dog at dusk and occasionally paused to comment on the weather. Those relationships became tiny islands of human contact that reminded him he had chosen something worth protecting. Within the walls of his house, the garage was more than just a place to stow a car and a toolbox. It was carved from intention. Marcus had laid an epoxy floor that reflected the light like water and had installed pegboards to hang tools by size and purpose. He had a small radio, a box of childhood mementos in the corner, old baseball cards, a photograph of his parents on their wedding day, and a workbench with a lamp that threw a soft halo over his hands. It was where he fixed bicycles for neighborhood kids, where he tuned an old motorcycle he sometimes took for weekend rides, where he rehearsed speeches in his head for moments he knew might demand explanation. The garage was ordered, and in its order he felt a tenuous control he had not had in many parts of his life. Closing that door at night felt like a promise that within those borders he could breathe. Still, Marcus's breathing was not always even. He had learned to notice certain glances, how long someone's eyes would rest on his mailbox, the slight stiffening of a neighbor's smile when he passed with grocery bags. Those small indicators accumulated like frost, building a chill across the porch of his life. He questioned himself often in private. Had he misread things? Was the paranoia his own work? There were nights he could not tell the difference between vigilance and oversensitivity. He sought balance in household routines, in the small acts that proved his membership, watering the lawn on the right day, filing HOA paperwork on time, attending community cleanups. The city's larger history lived in the edges of his mind. News cycles ran reels of other men and women who had been forced into braces and cages by misunderstandings that were anything but random. Marcus watched those stories like a man watching a map to avoid traps. They taught him how quickly ordinary life could spiral into a headline. He had rehearsed in silence for scenarios that never came. The way to keep his hands visible, the neutral tone that might not be read as aggression, the polite phrases to forestall accusations. It felt absurd to live a life so primed for defense, in a place that sold itself on safe streets. But the lessons had been earned. On a bright morning that had started like any other, Marcus went for his run, the neighborhood unfolding with the soft familiarity of the route. He passed the same lampposts, the same hedgerows, the same neighbors taking their dogs out. He noticed Linda at the end of her driveway, arms folded like a sentinel, watching the street with a look that suggested ownership. She watched, not with curiosity but with ownership, each face, each movement catalogued. He offered a polite nod. It was not returned. It was a moment small enough to be shrugged away, and yet it landed in him like a pebble dropped into water. The ripples reaching later into the day, when he returned, boots damp from dew, the garage door rolled up and sunlight spilled into his sanctuary. He set tools down with a practiced motion, feeling the ease of routine settle into his shoulders. He had no inkling that a quiet escalation had begun in the margin of his day. He had no idea that someone was already rehearsing a trespass that would not be merely about a car or a parking space, but about who could claim space and who could be told without consequence that they did not belong. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that order would be enough. He believed in the house he had bought and the care he had taken. He believed that property, rule, and quiet civility would protect him. And in that small confidence, the neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see if belonging would survive the first outward sign of defiance. The first time Marcus noticed something strange, it seemed like nothing. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way, the kind of day people forget as soon as it ends. He came home from a grocery run, bags lined up in his hands, only to see faint tire tracks leading into his driveway. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe the landscapers had turned around there, or maybe it was a delivery truck. Oak Ridge was always buzzing with service vans and gardeners trimming hedges. Still, the sight left a faint unease, like a knock he hadn't heard but felt in his chest. The unease deepened days later when he opened his garage and found the faintest smear of rubber against the smooth floor, like a signature left behind. He knew every inch of that space, had polished it enough times to notice when something changed. It wasn't his car that had left it. The mark was new. Someone had been inside. Marcus's stomach tightened, but he tried to reason with himself. Perhaps he had let his imagination run ahead of him. Perhaps the maintenance crew had leaned too close. He had no proof, just a mark on the floor and a tightening in his chest. And yet, he checked the garage door twice that night, lingering as the heavy metal closed with a final thud. The sound, usually comforting, now carried an edge of warning. The next week, he caught the first undeniable sign. Pulling into his driveway after a late afternoon jog, Marcus slowed as the garage came into view. The door, which he always kept shut, was standing wide open. For a heartbeat, he froze, scanning the edges of the space, half expecting to see movement. His tools were untouched. His shelves stood as neat as ever. The only thing out of place was the emptiness, the silent accusation that someone had been where they didn't belong. Neighbors passed on the sidewalk, their glances curious, perhaps even entertained. None stopped to ask if he was okay. He shut the door quickly, heart thudding, telling himself it must have been a malfunction, a technical error with the remote. But deep down, he felt the cold truth settling. Someone had been bold enough to walk into his sanctuary. Then came the day that erased all doubt. Marcus returned from errands, paper bags rustling in his arms, only to see a car, sleek, silver, unfamiliar, parked squarely in his garage. His pulse hammered in disbelief. The car didn't just block the space, it claimed it. His tools, his shelves, his boxes, background to someone else's arrogance. The garage door stood open, almost taunting, as if whoever had parked there had no fear of being caught. Standing in the driveway, Marcus felt a rush of emotions collide: confusion, violation, anger. The space had been his sanctuary, and now it had been invaded. He stepped closer, scanning the windshield. The driver's seat was empty. No note, no explanation, just entitlement sitting on four wheels. And then, as if summoned by the very thought, Linda Carter appeared. She strolled across the street, sunglasses perched on her head, her expression one of casual ownership. Her voice floated toward him, sharp and breezy all at once. She said something about needing the space for just a moment, her words dismissive, as if Marcus should feel grateful for the honor of her car occupying his garage. She didn't ask permission. She announced it. Marcus stood frozen. In that instant, the weight of every violation he had endured in Oak Ridge pressed against his chest, the warning notes, the stares, the measuring glances. Now here was Linda, not even hiding her disdain, treating his property as an accessory to her convenience. Neighbors noticed. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. A couple walking their dog slowed down, their eyes darting between Marcus and Linda. The air thickened with the unspoken question: would he challenge her? Or would he, like so many times before, let it slide? He wanted to shout, to demand she move, to reclaim his space. But he also knew the stakes. In neighborhoods like Oak Ridge, when a black man raised his voice, it wasn't heard as anger, it was labeled aggression. He had seen it play out too many times. The risk wasn't just conflict, it was escalation. The kind that could leave him branded as a problem or worse. His silence in that moment wasn't weakness, it was survival. Linda, reading his pause as submission, smirked. She turned back toward her house, tossing over her shoulder that she'd only be a few minutes. Her heels clicked against the pavement like punctuation marks, each one drilling into his pride. The silver car remained, bold and unmoving. That night, Marcus sat in his garage long after the car had gone, staring at the empty space as if it still carried the weight of intrusion. The garage no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt fragile, vulnerable, tainted by the knowledge that someone believed they had the right to take it. His mind churned with questions. What if she did it again? What if others followed? What if no one in Oak Ridge cared enough to stop her? The following days brought no reprieve. Twice more, Marcus found Linda's car occupying his garage, always with the same breezy dismissal. Once, she even left the door rolled shut, her vehicle locked inside as if the space were hers by contract. Each time, Marcus felt his restraint stretch thinner, the coil inside him winding tighter. Each time, neighbors glanced and looked away, their silence complicit. Whispers began to follow him at HOA meetings, at mailboxes. He caught fragments. Maybe he doesn't really use it. He should be more flexible. Linda's been here forever. The neighborhood wasn't just ignoring the violation, it was rationalizing it. His ownership meant less, his voice meant less, because his presence itself was considered conditional. The injustice dug deeper when he discovered a new notice taped to his door, a warning about garage door misuse. The HOA claimed his door had been left open multiple times. Marcus knew the truth. Linda had left it open, carelessly, arrogantly, but the blame had landed squarely on him. The violation wasn't just physical anymore, it was bureaucratic, woven into the rules meant to protect. Marcus realized he was being cornered. If he fought back openly, he risked being painted as hostile. If he stayed silent, he surrendered his dignity piece by piece. Each invasion became a question of how much he was willing to endure to keep the fragile peace of Oak Ridge. And then came the breaking point. One Friday evening, Marcus returned from work to find not only Linda's car in his garage but the door locked shut. His keypad code didn't respond. His own sanctuary had been turned against him, sealed by someone else's arrogance. Standing in his driveway, the sun sinking low in shadows stretching across the neat lawns, Marcus felt the coil inside him snap. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overreacting. He was being pushed, tested, erased in slow motion. The garage was no longer just a space, it was the battleground for his dignity. As the last light of day bled into night, Marcus knew one thing with chilling clarity. He could no longer wait for courtesy or fairness to protect him. He would have to choose compliance or defiance, silence or action. And the choice he was about to make would not just reclaim a garage. It would shake the entire neighborhood. Awake, the light in the cul-de-sac had shifted from late afternoon gold to a hard, clinical dusk that made shadows long and edges sharper. Marcus stood frozen on the driveway, palms pressed flat against the cold metal of the keypad until the small plastic warmed beneath his skin. The numbers flashed red again, denying him entry. The lock's refusal sounded less like a mechanical error and more like a verdict. Someone had chosen this moment to tell him, without pretense, that his right to this place could be contested and overridden. He felt the old, familiar coil of restraint tighten inside him, the muscle memory of compromise shaped by 1,000 earlier warnings. It had been drilled into him in quiet lessons from parents who had taught survival as a daily practice, how to lower a voice, how to move slowly, how to let small indignities pass so the larger harm might be avoided. Those lessons had always been practical, but never fair. Tonight, as the keypad refused his code, the lessons felt like a map that might no longer guide him. The map had always assumed he would not be pushed to this edge. But here he was, across the street. A figure stood, like a statue of entitlement. Linda's posture was deliberate. Even in the dying light, she occupied the scene like she owned its center. She had arranged this every visit to his garage, every staged violation note so precisely that watching it unfold felt less like surprise and more like confirmation of a plan. Her expression was a study in performance. She had learned how to summon a particular kind of outrage and make others lean toward it. Tonight she had summoned it well. Neighbors began to appear as though called by some unseen cue. Porch lights clicked on, curtains parted. The cluster of houses, each a small rectangle of privacy, exhaled occupants who swapped the safety of their living rooms for the spectacle of the street. Some watched from hedges and doorways, faces half hidden by shadows, their phones already half raised in curiosity. Others stood in plain view, shoulders squared in the cautious solidarity of bystanders who measure intervention against convenience. Marcus measured the scene too. The stakes coalesced into a single, crystalline truth. Whatever he did now might not be judged by fairness. It would be judged by history, habit, and the inertia of assumptions about who was dangerous and who was to be believed. He could feel the weight of those assumptions pressing at his ribs. He had seen this pattern. One person performing fear, the rest reshuffling their senses to match that performance. He knew how quickly instruments of authority could be summoned. He had watched too many viral videos where the smallest movement by a black man became grounds for tragedy. The HOA president, who always carried a clipboard and a sense of authority like a talisman, came into view at the cul-de-sac's mouth, as if the neighborhood had its own referee summoned to adjudicate the scene. His steps were steady, expression practiced neutral, but Marcus detected the almost imperceptible tilt of allegiance. Community order favored those who had most loudly proclaimed their ownership. That tilt felt like a pre-existing condition. Marcus had learned to account for it. Linda's posture shifted in that specific way Marcus recognized now as the setup. She moved with calculated indignation, the kind that raised brows and lent urgency to her gestures. She framed herself in a terror she did not feel, performing the script of a threatened woman to an audience primed to believe. People edged closer, breathless attention sharpened. The performance was effective. A few heads nodded, some voices soft. Uncertain seemed to accept the narrative before even a full picture existed. Marcus's mind ran through practical responses like a technician troubleshooting a failing system. He could call the HOA, file more complaints, take pictures. He had tried those things and watched them be turned, like any instruments, into evidence that could be bent toward the person with more social leverage. He could call the police, but he knew how that often looked on a lawn like his, a calm man reduced to a problem statement, a set of hands and a tone. The police might arrive carrying the assumption that the woman in visible distress required protection, that the man who owned the house was the source of escalation. The possibility bore down on him with a cold clarity. Each option felt like stepping into a sieve that filtered out truth and kept only whatever reinforced a dominant story. There was another choice, more immediate, more desperate. He could unlock his own garage by force of technology, using the phone app he had set up months ago for convenience and safety. He had installed the system precisely because it let him control entry without leaving his house to fumble with keys. It felt both intimate and bold to consider using it now, to let his own technology unmask someone who had treated his space as an entitlement. As he thumbed his phone, memories came rushing, the long nights of code and overtime, the pay stubs, folded into a careful plan that had finally bought him this mailbox and this door, the small ritual of sweeping the garage floor that left it gleaming like a promise. He thought of his mother's hands, calloused and patient, teaching him to press down on a broom until the dirt surrendered. He thought of his sister's laugh that had made the house feel like more than walls. Those private intimacies pooled together into a stubborn center that would not let him be erased. He tapped the app. The lock acknowledged with a quiet series of digital beeps only he could hear. The gear inside the garage stuttered, then moved. The door began its slow ascent, a metallic inhale that filled the cul-de-sac with a harsh shaft of light. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended in that glow. The silver car seated like a trophy, the smirk on its owner's face caught and held, the crowd leaning forward as if to see the truth unfold. The sight of the car in his own garage stunned the gathering. Light cut across chrome, across Linda's composed face, across the neat pegboard and the old boxes stacked along his workbench. Evidence is a strange thing. When it is material, when it is undeniable, it has a force that words alone cannot generate. Phones lifted, lenses focused. A murmur swelled and then split into competing currents. Some viewers moved toward confirmation, others toward disbelief, all captured in the aperture of glowing screens. Linda's demeanor changed. Performance bent under the weight of reality. Her hands pressed against her chest in a practiced collapse, but now the collapse was undercut by the visual proof of the car inside his property. The narrative she had hoped to spin suddenly had holes that the phone cameras and the light refused to ignore. Yet she did not step back. She doubled down, amplifying the theatrics into a higher level of performance, her fear becoming louder, more brittle. She threw images into the air like a net, seeking to catch sympathy even as the net itself was riddled with holes. Several neighbors shifted their positions. One older woman, who had walked her dog past Marcus's house for years, pushed herself to the front of the gathering and raised a phone with trembling fingers. The steadiness of her capture felt like an act of courage. A man who had often sat at his porch with a newspaper hesitated, then reached into his pocket to join the chorus of recording witnesses. A teenager who had been scrolling simply stopped and let his camera roll, his attention suddenly anchored. But where proof gathered, so did risk. Linda screamed accusation no. She framed it. The story unfolded in the space between her actions and the script she offered. She accused him of being aggressive, of trapping her, of threatening harm. Those words, spun outward, were a dangerous kind of weapon. They did not require evidence so much as repetition. She repeated the narrative with a volume meant to drown the images. It is the old sleight of hand. Drown the truth in volume until the senses give up and choose a simpler story. Marcus felt the shape of danger tighten. He kept his hands visible, keeping his body language deliberate, because he understood the geometry of misinterpretation. Every muscle that wanted to move forward stopped. Every impulse to point at the car or to name the pattern of harassment was folded back into composure. His silence was not surrender. It was strategy against a world that too often misread strength. The distant wail of a siren threaded into the night, itself a new kind of punctuation. Cars turned their headlights like interrogators and swept across faces. People stepped back and then closer again in a jittery rhythm. The approach of uniformed vehicles added weight to the moment. The sirens made the air tremble, and with them came the complex calculus of what the officers would see and how quickly they would choose which story to believe. When the police arrived, their lights washed the street in staccato red and blue, painting the houses like alternately righteous and suspicious. Officers moved with the procedural efficiency of trained teams, radios murmuring into shoulders, boots finding pavement. They formed a perimeter that implicitly favored the woman who had called, whose performative fear had already driven the call. Marcus watched their faces, searching for a single micro-gesture, a single line of empathy. There was competence, but there was also the fast, automatic reflex to see the scene through the lens of the caller's voice, an occupational hazard of policing, and one that could be lethal. An officer approached Marcus with careful steps and an outstretched hand that was not accusatory but procedural. Marcus felt the syllables of compliance coil in his throat. He followed the movement required by the situation, palms visible, shoulders steady, the posture of someone who offered no sudden motion that could be read as threat. He held himself inside the small room of control. He had left himself an act of survival that felt both dignified and humiliating. Yet even as the officers catalogued the scene, witnesses continued to react. A neighbor whose earlier silence had felt like complicity stepped forward, voice shaky but direct, describing the repeated trespasses she had observed. Another neighbor produced a clip on his phone, the one that showed Linda driving into Marcus's garage and leaving it there. The images were unarguable. The cameras had caught what memory tried to deny. In those frames, the truth was luminous and stubborn. The officer's posture shifted, the modification subtle at first, then palpable. Doubt, that slow and uncertain quality, entered the space where certainty had briefly ruled. One of the officers, who had initially seemed inclined to treat Marcus as the source of trouble, hesitated, eyes flicking between the video and Linda's taut face. The pause was enough, a small wedge opening under the heavy door of accusation. But the danger was not over. The officer's hand hovered near the belt for a moment that stretched like a rope. Marcus felt the history of similar moments in other towns and cities rise in his chest and press into his throat. The civic machinery, could reset at any beat. One officer's read might undo the delicate balance the video had afforded him. He imagined the worst: hands snapping a cuff, a headline misnaming the truth, a life reduced to a sensation of absence. For a breathless second, the night held its breath with him. In that tensile silence, the crowd's recordings rotated through the air like a chorus of tiny witnesses. The footage had done its work by revealing a material fact. The car had been in his garage, the decision to park there had been hers, and the pattern of petty sabotage had been orchestrated. The visual proof did more than clear an accusation. It shifted the moral gravity of the street. People who had leaned toward complacency now had to reassess the stories they had been telling themselves. Still, power does not relinquish itself easily. Linda's outrage hardened into a last resort. Embellishment, louder panic, the invocation of fear as a weapon. Her voice rose and fragmented the air, and even as the cameras recorded, the emotional register she staged had a pull on old reflexes. The officer who had hesitated now looked at his partner, the two of them parsing call reports with the careful pragmatism of professionals who are also human beings with instincts shaped by thousands of prior scenes. A single choice, one that could be made in a breath, would determine whether he walked back into his house that night or sat in the back of a squad car while words and hearsay filled the void. It was then that a neighbor who had always been small in neighborhood conversations stepped fully into view. Her posture was unassuming but resolute. She described, in clear, breathless recollection, the pattern of Linda's actions, how the neighbor had seen the car parked before, how the violation notices always seemed to target Marcus. The neighbor's words were not the flamboyant accusation of someone seeking attention, but the quiet testimony of someone who had watched and finally chosen to speak. Another neighbor corroborated with a clip. Another produced a time-stamped photo. The wall of corroboration rose brick by brick. The officer's hand finally relaxed from the holster. His stance softened in a subtle but decisive way. He lowered the notepad and exchanged looks with his partner, and the equilibrium that had teetered now found a new balance. The sound of the neighborhood changed. Where there had been a sharp edge of danger, there was now the complex, uneasy relief of a peril averted. Yet Marcus could not mistake the fragility of the shift. It relied on witnesses who had chosen, in the nick of time, to look up and say what they had seen. He stood in the glow of that fragile vindication, every muscle still wound tight. The garage door had been opened by his hand, the car exposed. The cameras rolling. Legal outcomes still waited in the wings. Paperwork would take hours. Reputations would be picked apart. The HOA might craft statements that produced new skirmishes. But in that moment, with the footage stored and the neighbors' voices now aligned, Marcus felt something like a small, hard victory that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. The night did not end with triumph so much as with a sober recognition. The system that could have swallowed him had instead been checked by the simple mechanical facts a phone could capture and by neighbors willing to interrupt their silence. The resolution of the scene was not a single dramatic unmasking, but a slow rebalancing that arrived because enough people chose to witness rather than look away. And yet, even as relief spread, the sound of distant sirens returned, backup called, complaints filed, legal processes beginning their inevitable spin. Marcus realized that the immediate danger had been averted, but the larger fight was only starting. Paperwork, HOA meetings, whispered resentments, and the thin machinery of institutional power could still make his life difficult. The moment had moved from the visceral to the bureaucratic, but the toll remained. On the edge of the gathering, a phone's camera kept rolling, capturing the afterglow of what had just occurred. A man who had been nearly criminalized for defending his property. A woman whose entitlement had been made plain. A neighborhood forced to reckon with what it condoned by silence. Marcus felt the weight of those frames settle in his chest and knew that what he had done, what the neighborhood had witnessed, would not simply be seared into local gossip and then forgotten. It would travel. It would be shown, rewatched, shared and argued over. The court of public opinion had its own law, and tonight it had begun to serve judgment. The key click of the lock still hummed faintly in his bones. He had opened a door and, in doing so, opened something else. A question of who would stand when it mattered. A question about how many times silence would be allowed to protect aggression. The night had not resolved into need justice. It had landed on a precipice where the next set of choices by neighbors, by the HOA, by officers who would write reports would determine how much of his life could be rebuilt and how much of it would remain shadowed by the attempt to erase him. In the hush that followed, with his garage door raised and the street full of lights and faces, Marcus registered one final, small sound. The distant, intermittent knock of another car door, as though someone else had come to look and listen. The world had shifted a little, but nothing would be simple again. The scene had been exposed, but the future legal, social, personal hung fragile and unresolved, waiting on decisions that would come after the sirens, after the statements, after the meetings. Everything had been put in motion. The next moment would lend one way or another, and that irreducible fact was an ache behind his ribs that he would carry into the long nights to come. The red and blue lights eventually faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet suburban night. What remained was not peace but an unsettled silence, neighbors dispersing reluctantly, their whispers drifting into the still air, their screens filled with recordings they weren't sure what to do with. The cul-de-sac, once buzzing with a dangerous energy, settled into a fragile calm, like a room after a storm where the furniture is still upright but the air is heavy with what almost was. Marcus stood in his driveway long after the last cruiser had turned the corner. His garage door, still raised, revealed the silver car parked inside, mute testimony to everything that had happened. He hadn't moved it yet. Part of him wanted to close the door and seal the night away, but another part knew it needed to stay visible, at least for now. He wanted the neighborhood to remember, to see with their own eyes, if only for a moment longer, what entitlement looked like when it was stripped bare of excuses. When he finally stepped back inside his house, the silence hit him harder than the noise outside ever could. His hands trembled as he locked the door behind him, fingers fumbling on the deadbolt though he had done it 1,000 times before. His living room, once a sanctuary after long days, now felt smaller, tighter. He paced, then sat, then stood again, unable to settle. Every creak of the floorboard sounded amplified. Every shadow at the window felt like a reminder that safety was fragile, conditional, revocable. Sleep didn't come that night. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, the light from his phone screen pulling across his chest. Notifications buzzed endlessly, neighbors sending clips, friends forwarding articles about similar incidents, some simply writing, "Are you okay?" But how could he explain that okay was a word too shallow for the weight in his chest? He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't been handcuffed. He was alive, unbroken, and uncharged. But the cost of that survival was a wound invisible to most. The knowledge that all it had taken was one lie, one performance, and his life could have been rewritten as a threat. The following days blurred together. He still went to work, but the motions felt mechanical. In the office, his colleagues offered sympathetic nods without asking questions. Some avoided eye contact as though proximity to his experience might demand reflection they weren't ready for. In the grocery store, familiar faces hesitated before speaking, their smiles tentative. The footage had spread beyond the neighborhood now, shared by local pages and whispered in digital corners. Marcus had become both a symbol and a spectacle. People recognized him, not for who he was, but for what had almost been taken from him. The HOA inevitably called an emergency meeting. Marcus attended, though every muscle in his body told him not to. The community center's fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh glow, the folding chairs arranged in neat rows that felt more like an inquisition than a gathering. Linda arrived, defiant even in disgrace, her face set in the brittle mask of someone unwilling to concede. She spun stories of misunderstanding, framed her actions as concern for the neighborhood's safety, painting herself as a guardian rather than an aggressor. But the recordings circulating on phones, even as she spoke, undermined her every word. Some neighbors rallied to Marcus, their voices measured but firm, describing the harassment they had quietly observed. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to break ranks with Linda, unwilling to admit that silence had made them complicit. The room vibrated with unspoken divisions, fault lines that had always existed but were now exposed like cracks in old plaster. Marcus sat quietly, letting their words wash over him, refusing to be baited into defending his right to exist in the home he had bought with his own hands. The HOA eventually voted. Linda lost her position on the board, her violations formally documented. On paper, Marcus had won, but victory felt thin, fragile, almost hollow. Paper couldn't erase the memory of neighbors hesitating before speaking, of officers' hands hovering near holsters, of the weight of knowing that his dignity had been debated like a line item on an agenda. At home, Marcus tried to rebuild routine. He swept his garage floor, moved the silver car out, and locked the door with deliberate care. He watered the plants by his porch, nodding politely at passersby. He returned to the small rituals that had once anchored his life. But beneath each motion was a pulse of vigilance, a quiet dread that something else could happen again. That peace was not permanent, only borrowed, and yet, in the cracks of exhaustion, something else stirred. Strength, unexpected and stubborn. Messages arrived from strangers across the city, people who had seen the story online, who had written to say thank you for standing firm, for not backing down, for letting the truth be seen. Some shared their own stories of being followed, questioned, accused in their own neighborhoods. Stories too similar to be coincidence. Stories that built a mosaic of injustice stretching far beyond one cul-de-sac. Marcus realized then that what had happened wasn't just about him. His story was a thread in a tapestry woven long before he was born. His near erasure was part of a pattern too familiar, too rehearsed to be random. And while the outcome had bent toward truth this time, he knew countless others hadn't been so fortunate. The impact echoed in the neighborhood too. Some relationships grew stronger. Neighbors who had once been silent now waved more deliberately, their greetings carrying the weight of apology. Others grew colder, their silence deepening into resentment, as though Marcus's survival had somehow cost them comfort. The street was the same, but it wasn't. The lines had been redrawn, the truths exposed. The illusion of harmony had cracked, and behind it lay the uncomfortable reality that not everyone wished him well. Weeks later, Marcus sat on his porch as the sun dipped low, the sky bruised with purples and golds. He thought of that night again, the moment when the lock had denied him, when his hands had trembled, when a lie nearly stole his name. He thought of his mother's lessons, of his father's warnings, of every unspoken rule passed down like inheritance. And he realized a cruel irony. Survival had always been his first language, but dignity, true, unshaken dignity, was still something he had to fight for daily. The car was gone, Linda's seat on the HOA vacant, the official reports filed away, but the memory remained, heavy and sharp. He knew it would live in him long after the neighborhood forgot. And that was the truest weight of racism. It did not vanish when the paperwork was signed or when the crowd dispersed. It lingered unseen, reshaping the way its victims moved through the world. Marcus's story was not unique. That was the bitter truth. For every moment captured on camera, countless others unfolded in silence. For every man who managed to expose the lie, countless others were buried beneath it. His survival was not proof of progress, it was proof of how much danger still existed. So he sat with the question the night left him with. How many more times? How many more lives bent under suspicion? How many more accusations weaponized? How many more names nearly erased before people finally stopped looking away? And maybe the harder question lingered too. What would you have done if you had been there? Would you have spoken? Recorded? Believed? Or would you have stood in the shadows, watching, silent, complicit? Marcus knew his answer. He had lived it. But for those watching, for those listening, the answer still hung in the air, demanding to be faced. Because this wasn't just one man's story. It was the story of a country. A story of survival stitched into daily life. A story that asked, not for sympathy, but for courage. And the next chapter, that would depend on us.